The scream of the wind was the only sermon Lone Mesa had heard in months, a long, mournful cry across the Texas plains of 1879. Inside a cabin clinging to the edge of the world, Abigail Reed saw her late son's face in the dying fire, a ghost of warmth against the coming cold. The silence of her home was a weight, a constant reminder of the life that had been hollowed out first by fever, then by a husband who could no longer stand the sight of her grief. That quiet was broken by the familiar, heavy tread of Jedediah Stone on her porch. He brought a stack of freshly split oak, his presence a mixture of genuine concern and suffocating pity. "Just wanted to make sure you're set for the night, Abigail," he said, his eyes avoiding the empty cradle in the corner. "It's not right, a woman alone out here." She thanked him with a polite firmness that offered no invitation to stay, her independence a shield she wore like armor. As the sound of his horse faded into the dusk, a different sound took its place. A frantic, desperate pounding rattled the very bones of her home. It wasn't the wind. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she grabbed the old Winchester. The pounding came again, accompanied by a voice torn by a grief that mirrored her own. "Please. Milk. My son is dying." Her blood ran cold. Through the peephole, she saw him, an Apache warrior, his face a mask of agony, and in his arms, a tiny, still form. Beyond him, the faint glow of lanterns gathered, her neighbors, Jed among them, watching, waiting, judging. The life she knew ended at that moment. The choice she made next would either save a soul or condemn her own. Fan 1. A whisper of life. Sevens. The latch clicked shut, a sound of finality that echoed the slamming of a door on her old life. The world outside, with its watching lanterns and whispering judgments, vanished, leaving only the stark reality within the 4 log walls of the cabin. Kyle stood frozen just inside the threshold, a statue carved from prairie dust and desperation, his warrior's pride eclipsed by the fierce, protective terror of a father. In his arms, the infant Samuel was a fragile weight, his breaths so shallow they were more a memory than a fact. Abigail Reed did not hesitate. The instinct that had been buried with her own son, Daniel, clawed its way back to the surface, raw and undeniable. She moved past Kyle, her motions fluid and certain, and gestured toward the hearth. "Here," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "By the fire." He moved as if in a trance, kneeling on the rough-hewn floorboards and placing the bundled child onto the worn bearskin rug she'd laid out. The firelight danced across the baby's face, revealing skin the color of ash, lips cracked and tinged with blue. There was no time for questions, no room for the fear that pricked at the edges of her mind. With trembling fingers, Abigail unbuttoned the high collar of her dress, the same worn calico she'd worn for months, and pulled aside her chemise. She lifted the impossibly light child, his small head lolling with weakness, and guided his mouth to her breast. For a heart-stopping moment, there was nothing. The baby's lips fumbled, too weak to latch. A silent sob caught in Abigail's throat. "Come on, little one," she whispered, a prayer to a God she hadn't spoken to in years. She touched his cheek, stroking the soft, downy hair, and tried again. Then, a flicker of life. A weak, desperate pull, then another, stronger this time. He had latched. Abigail exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, the warmth of the infant's mouth against her skin, a jolt that was both agonizing and exquisite. Tears she thought had long dried up slipped down her cheeks, baptizing the child's forehead as he began to suckle, a tiny, determined rhythm that was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Across the hearth, Cale watched, unmoving. The firelight cast deep shadows across the planes of his face, illuminating the exhaustion etched into every line, the dried blood crusted near his collarbone from a wound she hadn't noticed before. He said nothing, but his dark eyes held a universe of gratitude so profound it was humbling. That night, silence was their only language. After the child was full and sleeping soundly in the makeshift cradle of a padded drawer, Abigail offered Kyle a bowl of thin corn gruel, which he accepted with a solemn nod. He ate slowly, his gaze never straying from his son. He did not ask to stay, and she did not offer, but neither did she ask him to leave. He took up a vigil by the door, sitting on the floor with his back against the wood, a silent guardian against the cold and the encroaching darkness. Abigail sat in her rocking chair, the gentle creak of the wood, a lullaby for the child and a balm for her own frayed nerves. She watched the fire, but she saw the faces of her neighbors, their expressions shifting from suspicion to outright hostility. She heard Jed's voice in her head, his well-meaning words now feeling like a threat. Every gust of wind against the shutters sounded like an accusation. She had crossed a line, not just between her and the town, but between the woman she had been, the grieving, invisible widow, and the woman she was becoming. She was afraid, but beneath the fear was a bedrock of certainty. She looked at the sleeping child, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, and knew she would not, could not, turn back. The next morning, Cale was gone. For a panicked moment, her heart seized, but then she saw the baby still sleeping peacefully. Beside the cradle were 3 freshly caught trout, cleaned and laid neatly on a broad leaf. It was a statement, a payment, a promise. He returned at dusk, as silent as his departure, his face grim, but his eyes fixed on his son. This became their new rhythm, a life measured in sunrises and sunsets. Kyle would bring the child each morning and disappear into the scrubland, hunting or foraging, returning as the evening shadows grew long to reclaim him. They rarely spoke. Words felt clumsy, inadequate. Their communication existed in a shared bowl of stew, in the way she mended a tear in Samuel's thin blanket, in the way he left a brace of rabbits or a handful of wild onions on her porch. But the world outside the cabin was not silent. A week into their strange arrangement, Abigail needed flour and salt. Steeling herself, she walked the 2 miles into the settlement of Lone Mesa, a place that now felt alien and hostile. As she stepped into Silas Blackwood's general store, the low hum of conversation ceased. All eyes turned to her. Silas stood behind the counter, a gaunt, severe man whose eyes held the cold emptiness of a winter sky. He measured out her flour without a word, his movements precise and angry. As she paid, her gaze fell upon something small tucked behind the ledger on the counter. A worn, handmade doll with yarn for hair, its fabric faded and stained with time. Silas saw her looking. His hand instinctively covered the doll, his expression hardening into something dangerous. "Find what you need?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, a clear dismissal. Abigail simply nodded, her throat tight, and fled the store, the weight of a dozen hateful stares pressing on her back. The unspoken threat became a spoken one 2 days later. Jed Stone was waiting for her by the well as she drew her morning water. He no longer feigned neighborly concern. "Abigail, you have to stop this," he pleaded, his face earnest and troubled. "Folks are scared. They're saying you're housing a savage, a killer." "He is a father," she replied, her voice steady as she hauled up the bucket. "And his son was starving. It ain't your concern. This ain't our fight. Silas Blackwood is stirring folks up. He's talking to the old ranger company. Says the law won't do nothing so decent folk have to. He lost his wife and girl to a raid years back. He don't see a father, Abigail. He sees a ghost. You are putting yourself in the path of a man who's got nothing left to lose." Her hands tightened on the rope. "And what would you have me do, Jed? Let a baby die on my porch so Mr. Blackwood can sleep better at night?" Jed shook his head, a look of profound disappointment on his face. "I thought you were smarter than this. I thought your husband, he would have never stood for this." The mention of her husband was a low blow, and it struck its mark. She turned away from him without another word, carrying her water buckets with a dignity she did not feel, the water sloshing with every trembling step. That evening, the weight of it all felt crushing. The town was against her. Jed had turned on her, and a man broken by grief was pointing his hatred in her direction. She felt utterly alone. When Cale came to collect Samuel, she almost told him it was over, that it was too dangerous. But as she wrapped the now thriving, gurgling baby in his blanket, her resolve hardened. This was not a mistake. It was a choice. After they left, as she cleaned the supper dishes, she noticed something on the small windowsill above her wash basin. It was a horse, no bigger than her palm, carved from the dark, rich heartwood of a cedar tree. Its legs were bent mid-gallop, its mane flowing back in an impossible, frozen wind. The detail was exquisite, the work of a patient and skilled hand. It was a thing of beauty, of life, of freedom. She picked it up, its smooth surface warm against her skin. It was a gift. It was a thank you. It was a message, she realized, far clearer than any words they could have spoken. It said that he understood the risk. It said he saw her courage. That night, she didn't immediately bar the door after the cabin was quiet. She stood by the window for a long time, peering into the moonlit darkness. And then she saw him. On a small rise about 100 yards from the cabin, his silhouette was unmistakable against the starry sky. He wasn't hiding. He was watching. He was standing guard. A profound sense of peace settled over her. She was not alone in this fight. She walked to the door, slid the heavy wooden bar into place, and knew with absolute certainty that the lock was no longer meant to keep him out, but to protect the small, fragile world the three of them had begun to build inside. Fan 2. Bones of Contention. Sevens. The passing of weeks settled a new kind of quiet into the cabin, a silence that was no longer born of grief and caution, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. The harsh edges of their strange cohabitation began to soften. Abigail found herself humming an old lullaby as she stitched a patch onto Samuel's blanket, only to look up and see Kyle watching her from the doorway, the corner of his mouth turned up in the barest shadow of a smile. He began to cross the threshold more often, not just to deliver the child, but to linger. One cold morning, he brought in a log for the fire so large she could never have managed it, setting it down with a quiet grunt. Another afternoon, He sat for an hour, patiently rehafting her broken axe handle with a strip of deer sinew, his large, capable hands moving with an artisan's grace. Samuel, now thriving, had become the sun around which their two lonely planets orbited. He had learned the curve of Abigail's neck and the timbre of Cale's low hum. He would gurgle and reach with his tiny fists for the single hawk feather that now hung from a peg above his cradle, a silent testament to the life that had been saved within these walls. This fragile domesticity, however, was an island in a growing sea of hatred. The whispers that had followed Abigail in town now took on a physical form. One morning she found a dead rattlesnake coiled on her doorstep, its fangs bared in a clear warning. A few days later, a rock shattered the small window pane over her wash basin, thrown by a hand that vanished into the darkness. The children who once waved now ran when they saw her, or worse, stood at a distance and chanted cruel names learned from their parents. The town of Lone Mesa was closing ranks, and she was on the outside. The only exception was Martha Thorne, the preacher's widow, a woman whose spine was as straight as her faith. She met Abigail by the creek one afternoon, pretending to inspect the wild mint, and pressed a small, cloth-wrapped parcel into her hand. "Cornbread with molasses," she whispered, her sharp eyes scanning the trail. "A growing boy needs sweetness. And so does his mother. Don't you let them starve the kindness out of you, child. It's the only weapon we have that they don't." The growing danger acted as a crucible, forcing the unspoken bond between Abigail and Cale into something stronger. One evening, she saw him by the fire, his face taut with pain as he tried to clean the old wound on his collarbone, which had become inflamed. She put down her mending. "Let me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. He hesitated, his warrior's instinct to show no weakness warring with the exhaustion in his bones, but he relented. As she gently cleaned the wound with boiled water and willow bark, the physical closeness became a bridge. "My name," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "It is Cale." The name hung in the air between them, the first piece of himself he had truly offered. He told her then, in short, clipped sentences, of the soldiers, the flash of fire that had destroyed his camp, and of his wife, Ehawi, who had died with an arrow in her back, a final, desperate act to give him and their son a chance to flee. "He is all that is left," Cale finished, his gaze fixed on the sleeping child. "Taklashim. Our name for him. It means he who was pulled from the fire." Abigail's own grief, so long locked away, rose to meet his. She went to her small wooden chest and took out a tiny, crudely carved wooden bird. "This was for my son, Daniel," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "My husband carved it. The fever took Daniel at 6 weeks. And my husband, he followed not long after." Said the silence in this house was louder than a scream. She placed the bird in Cale's open palm. He looked at the small token, then back at her, and in that moment, they were no longer a white woman and an Apache man. They were simply two people who understood the shape of the hole that loss leaves in a soul. He closed his hand around the bird, a silent promise to guard her story as she had guarded his son. But the world would not let them grieve in peace. The following Saturday, the air grew heavy and still, the way it does before a storm. Abigail felt it first, a tremor in the ground that was not thunder. Then she heard it. The rhythmic beat of a dozen hooves, the jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of angry male voices. Kyle was instantly on his feet, his body coiled like a snake, his hand reaching for the knife he kept sheathed at his back. "No," Abigail said, placing a hand on his arm. "This is my door. My fight." She lifted a now-awake Samuel from his cradle, settled him on her hip, and walked to the door. She unbarred it and stepped onto the porch, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun. Silas Blackwood sat astride a tall bay horse, flanked by 10 men, including a deeply uncomfortable-looking Jed Stone. Their faces were a mixture of fear, righteousness, and grim determination. "Abigail," Silas began, his voice devoid of warmth, "we've come to put an end to this foolishness. This is a God-fearing settlement. We will not harbor a heathen savage in our midst. You will give him and the boy to us. We'll see them put on a reservation where they belong." "He has done you no harm, Silas," Abigail said, her voice shaking only slightly. Samuel began to fuss, sensing the tension. "He's an Apache," another man shouted. "That's harm enough." Jed shifted in his saddle. "Abigail, please, just listen to reason. Do this for your own safety." Abigail looked past them, at the endless prairie, at the vast, indifferent sky. Then she looked directly at Silas Blackwood, her gaze unwavering. "I remember a sermon Reverend Thorne gave once," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "He spoke of a stranger in a strange land. He spoke of charity. He spoke of sheltering the weak. Did you men leave your Bibles at home today?" Silas sneered. "Don't you quote scripture at me, woman. Not while you're standing there protecting that thing." As he spoke, Samuel's fussing turned into a hungry cry. Without breaking eye contact with Silas, without acknowledging the rifles held loosely in the men's hands, Abigail calmly adjusted her shawl, turned slightly, and brought the crying infant to her breast. The baby's cries immediately quieted as he latched on, replaced by the soft sounds of nursing. The effect on the men was instantaneous and profound. It was a slap in the face, a rebuke so intimate and powerful it left them speechless. Their righteous anger faltered, replaced by a clumsy, awkward shame. They were men of ranches and farms, husbands and fathers themselves. They knew that sound. It was the sound of life, of innocence, of peace. It had no place in their world of violence and fear, and its presence exposed the ugliness of their errand. Rifles were lowered. Eyes darted to the ground. Jed looked as if he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. Only Silas Blackwood's hatred remained undimmed, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury at being so thoroughly disarmed. "This isn't over," he hissed, the words dripping with venom. He yanked on his reins, turning his horse so sharply it reared. "You've made your choice. Now you'll live with it." He spurred the horse and galloped away, his posse following in a scattered, disorganized retreat, their bravado shattered. Abigail remained on the porch long after the dust had settled, Samuel still nursing peacefully. The cabin door creaked open behind her. Cale stepped out and stood beside her, his eyes on the horizon where the riders had disappeared. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply stood with her, a silent partner in her defiance, a shared pillar against the storm they both knew was far from over. Fan 3. The Unraveling Thread. Sevens. The aftermath of the confrontation was not peace, but a thick, unnerving silence. Lone Mesa seemed to hold its breath. When Abigail walked the path to the creek, she was no longer met with glares, but with averted eyes and the stiff backs of neighbors who now treated her as if she were a ghost. The cabin became their entire world, an isolated fortress against the town's silent condemnation. Yet, within these walls, the silence that had once been a barrier was now a comfort, a shared language. The fear that had bound them together was slowly being replaced by something warmer, more durable. Their partnership, forged in the crucible of defiance, now settled into the simple, interlocking rhythms of a shared life. Cale, seeing the jagged hole in the window pane, spent a day meticulously crafting a new shutter, one that fit more snugly and was stronger than the original. Abigail found herself leaving a bowl of hot coffee for him by the hearth as he worked, an offering he accepted with a nod that spoke volumes. They began to teach each other their worlds in fragments. Holding up the carved horse, she would say its name, and he would respond with a soft, guttural word, "Cly-eye." He pointed to the fire, and she supplied the English word, watching the way his lips formed the unfamiliar sound. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and observant, and soon he could name the simple objects of their domestic life: table, cup, water, bread. In return, he taught her the Apache names for the hawk, the creek, the moon. It was in these moments that she saw past the warrior and the grieving father, and glimpsed the man himself, intelligent, patient, with a quiet resilience that was both humbling and deeply attractive. Samuel was the heart of their new world, a constant, happy presence whose gurgles and small triumphs were a source of shared joy. He had begun to roll over, a feat which earned a rare, genuine laugh from Kyle, a sound so rich and unexpected it made Abigail's heart ache. They were no longer two separate people caring for a child. They were becoming a unit, a strange and fragile constellation of three souls that had found each other in the dark. The unspoken tension between them, the raw, magnetic pull of two lonely people finding solace, grew with each passing day. One evening, after Samuel was asleep in his cradle, she was darning one of Cale's worn buckskin shirts by the firelight. He was sharpening his knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a soothing counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets outside. He finished his work and rose to add a log to the fire. As he passed her chair, he paused, his shadow falling over her. She looked up, and he was closer than she had realized. His eyes, dark and intense in the flickering light, held an expression she had never seen before, not gratitude, not grief, but a profound, questioning tenderness. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a spark that ignited the dry tinder of her long dormant heart. Her breath hitched. The world seemed to shrink to the space between their faces. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips, and she knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that he was going to kiss her. It was in that charged, perfect, heart-stopping moment that the knock came. It was not the frantic, desperate pounding of their first meeting, nor the angry thud of Silas Blackwood's men. It was a firm, deliberate, three-beat knock, patient, but insistent. The spell was shattered. They sprang apart, the moment of intimacy evaporating into sudden, cold alarm. Cale was instantly transformed. The tenderness in his eyes was replaced by the hard, watchful glare of the warrior. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening not just with his ears, but with his entire body. He moved to the door, not with fear, but with the grim readiness of a man meeting a fate he knew would one day find him. He slid the bar open a few inches and peered out. A low, guttural phrase in his own language escaped his lips, a word of shock, of disbelief. He opened the door fully. Standing on the porch, bathed in the pale moonlight, was a woman. She was Apache, tall and slender, with a long black braid that fell over one shoulder. She was dressed for a hard journey, her buckskins worn and dusty, but she held herself with an unyielding pride. Her face, etched with fatigue, was strikingly beautiful, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, immediately swept the scene inside the cabin. They landed on Cale, then flickered to Abigail, then settled on the cradle by the fire with an expression of stunned comprehension. A rapid, urgent conversation erupted between them in the Apache tongue. Abigail stood frozen by her chair, a helpless outsider. She could not understand the words, but she could read the story in their faces. She saw the relief and hope in the woman's eyes as she spoke to Cale, the way she gestured back towards the mountains. She saw the turmoil on Cale's face, a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, sorrow, and an agonizing weight of duty that seemed to settle on his shoulders, making him stoop. The woman, Tala, was her name. Abigail would learn later. She was the daughter of his chief's brother, the woman he had been promised to since they were children. She spoke of survivors. A handful of their people, the old and the very young, had escaped the soldiers' raid and had taken refuge deep in the Dragoon Mountains. They were starving, leaderless. Tala had been sent to find him. As the last direct descendant of their chief, it was his duty, his destiny, to return and lead them, to keep the flame of their people from being extinguished forever. As she spoke, Tala's gaze fell upon the small, carved wooden bird from Abigail's son, which Cale had placed on the mantelpiece. Her eyes narrowed. She looked from the bird to Abigail, and her expression hardened with a new, sharp-edged emotion. Jealousy, betrayal. She spoke a final, clipped sentence to Cale, her voice now cold and accusing. Cale's face was a mask of torment. He looked at Tala, the living embodiment of his past, his heritage, his sworn duty. Then his gaze shifted to Abigail, her face pale with a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. Finally, he looked at Samuel, sleeping peacefully in the cradle, the symbol of a future he had just begun to believe was possible. The thread that had woven their 3 lives into a fragile tapestry had not just unraveled, it had been sliced in 2. He was no longer a man seeking refuge, but a man trapped between 2 worlds, with a choice that would inevitably destroy one of them. Fan 4. A House Divided. Sevens. The air inside the cabin grew thick and hard to breathe, charged with the weight of unspoken words. The space that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a cage, too small to contain the clashing worlds of 3 wounded people. Tala accepted the offer to stay the night with a curt nod, her pride not allowing her to sleep outdoors after a long journey, but she chose a spot by the door, wrapping herself in her own blanket, creating a clear, physical boundary. An invisible line had been drawn down the middle of the room. On one side was the past, embodied by Tala, her presence a constant, silent accusation. On the other side was the fragile present Abigail had tried to build, a present that now felt like a foolish dream. Abigail retreated into herself, her warmth replaced by a brittle, protective coldness. She moved with a quiet, efficient fury, tending to Samuel, stirring the pot on the hearth, her movements jerky and precise, her face a carefully constructed mask of indifference. She would not let them see how her heart was breaking. Cale was trapped in the no-man's land between them, a silent ghost haunting his own life. His gaze flickered from Tala's rigid back to Abigail's averted face, his expression a storm of anguish and indecision. Every creak of the floorboards, every pop of the fire, screamed with the tension. Later that night, when Samuel was asleep and Tala's steady breathing signaled a fitful slumber, Kyle finally crossed the invisible line. He came to where Abigail sat, staring into the embers. "Abigail," he began, his voice low and strained. She did not look at him. "There is nothing you need to say." "Yes, there is," he insisted, kneeling before her, forcing her to meet his gaze. He told her everything then, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pained confession. He spoke of the promise made between his father and hers, of the duty that was his birthright. He spoke of the survivors, of their faces, their hunger, their hope, a hope that now rested entirely on him. "They are my people," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "They have nothing left. No one but me." He never said the words, "I have to leave her," but the truth of it hung between them, a guillotine blade waiting to fall. Abigail's carefully constructed mask finally cracked. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "She is your home, Kyle," she whispered, her voice hollow. "She is your history, your future. I was just a place to rest, a port in the storm." The pain in her voice was a physical blow, and he flinched as if struck. Before he could answer, she rose. "You should go to your son," she said, her voice flat, dismissing him, and the chasm between them felt 1,000 miles wide. The next morning, the tension was broken by the mundane necessity of water. Abigail took her buckets to the creek, and a few moments later, Tala followed. For a long time, they worked in silence, the only sounds the splash of water and the distant call of a crow. It was Tala who spoke first. "He is strong," she said, nodding towards the cabin where Samuel slept. "The child." "Yes," Abigail replied, not looking at her. "He has his father's spirit." Tala's sharp eyes studied Abigail's face. "My people are dying," she said, her voice dropping its hard edge, revealing a raw vulnerability beneath. "The old ones grow weak. The children forget our songs. Cale is the last son of our chief. Without him, the fire goes out. We become ghosts." She stepped closer. "You are a good woman. You saved him. But what can you offer him? A life hiding in the shadows of your world? A life where he must forget who he is? I can give him a nation. I can give him a people. I am his home. You are just his cage." The words were cruel, but they struck a chord of truth that resonated with Abigail's own deepest fears. While this war of hearts waged inside the cabin, the war of hatred was gathering outside. Jed Stone had seen Tala arrive. For him, it was the final proof. It was no longer one desperate man, but an envoy, a scout for a larger party. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped him. He rode into town, his horse lathered, and found Silas Blackwood stacking barrels outside his store. "There's another one," Jed said, his voice breathless. A woman. They're gathering. Silas, I know it. This was the spark Silas had been waiting for. The town's fear had been simmering. Now it was time to bring it to a boil. That night, in the dim, smoky light of the saloon, Silas stood on a table, the worn yarn doll belonging to his dead daughter clutched in his hand. They send their women now. He roared, his voice cracking with a grief that had curdled into venom. They send them to scout our homes, to see our weaknesses. How long until they send their warriors? How long until our wives and our daughters meet the same fate as my sweet Mary? He held up the doll. I will not let that happen. The law is too slow, too far away. We are the law now. We will protect our own. A roar of approval went up from the crowd of frightened, angry men. From the shadows at the back, Martha Thorne watched, her face grim. She knew this was no longer about fear. It was a prelude to a massacre. While the town sharpened its pitchforks, Abigail made a decision. She watched Cale trying to teach Samuel how to grip the carved horse, his face a portrait of love and torment, and she knew she could not be the anchor that drowned him. That evening, she came to him with a new, terrifying resolve in her eyes. You must go, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Tonight, take Tala. Take the boy. Go to your people and lead them. Keep them safe. Cale stared at her, stunned. What are you saying? I am saying that I will not be the woman who stands between a man and his people. I will not be the reason your son grows up without a tribe, without a history. Your place is with them. It was the purest, most painful act of love she could imagine, tearing her own heart out to save his. Her sacrifice, her willingness to give up everything, was the one thing that could cut through his paralysis. In that moment, he saw with blinding clarity that home was not a place you were born into, but a place you would die for. It was not just about the blood of the past, but the love of the present. He took her hands, his grip fierce. No, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound certainty. You told Silas Blackwood that you would not let a child starve on your porch. I will not let a family die in my heart. He looked at her, his eyes blazing. You and Samuel are my people now. Ehawi saved my son's life by giving her own. You saved it by giving him yours. My duty is here. He then laid out a new plan, born not of retreat, but of fierce, desperate hope. They would all leave. Not just him and Samuel, but her too. They would not go back to the mountains. That was Tala's path, and his past. They would go north, to the territories, where the land was wild and a man could start again, where a family of outcasts might be able to carve out a life. It was a mad, impossible plan, a flight into the unknown, leaving both their worlds behind. He turned to Tala, who had watched this exchange with wide, disbelieving eyes. My path is with them now. Tala, you must lead our people. Tell them my spirit will always be with them. Before she could answer, a faint sound drifted on the night wind, the distant baying of hounds and the angry shouts of men. Time had run out. Silas and his posse were coming. A frantic energy seized them as Abigail grabbed a satchel and began stuffing it with bread and jerky, while Kyle checked his rifle, his movements swift and sure. The house was no longer divided. It was united against a common foe, about to make one last, desperate stand. Fan 5. The Devil's Creek. Sevens. There was no time for farewells. As the distant, chilling sound of baying hounds reached them. A silent, urgent understanding passed between the three adults. Tala grabbed a spare blanket, her face a mask of grim resolve. "They will follow the tracks of 3 people," she said to Kale in their tongue, her voice low and swift. "I will lead them east, towards the broken bluffs. It will give you time. Follow the creek north, where the 2 great pines stand like brothers. That is the path." Before Kale could protest, she pressed her palm to his chest in a warrior's farewell, her eyes lingering for a heartbeat on Samuel, who was now secured against Abigail's chest in a makeshift sling. Then she was gone, a shadow melting into the darkness, a ghost sacrificing herself for a future she would not be a part of. The cabin door slammed shut behind them as Kale and Abigail plunged into the treacherous woods. The night was their enemy and their only friend, its deep shadows offering concealment but also hiding roots and rocks that threatened to trip them at every step. Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against Samuel's sleeping back. She focused on the steady presence of Kale in front of her, his body a dark, powerful shape clearing a path for them, his senses on high alert. The sounds of the hunt grew closer, shouts, the crack of a branch, the eager yelps of the dogs. It was a nightmare symphony conducted by Silas Blackwood, and they were the prey. They moved with a desperate speed, breath burning in their lungs, the cold night air slicing at their faces. They reached the creek Tala had spoken of, a ribbon of churning silver under the moonlight, wider and faster than they had anticipated. As Kale scouted for a shallow crossing, a single lantern flared to life on the opposite bank. Then another, and another. They were trapped. Figures emerged from the trees on both sides, cutting off any escape. At their head, standing on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the creek, was Silas Blackwood. A triumphant, cruel smile twisted his features. "Nowhere left to run, savage," he called out, his voice echoing in the sudden, dead silence. Kale reacted instantly, shoving Abigail and the baby behind a large granite boulder that offered meager cover. He raised his Winchester, the click of the hammer cocking the weapon sounding unnaturally loud. "You do not want this, Blackwood." Kale's voice was low and steady, a dangerous calm that belied the fury in his eyes. "Go home to your empty store and your ghosts." The mention of his ghosts sent a tremor of rage through Silas. "My ghosts will have their peace tonight," he roared. "This land must be cleansed. We'll start with you, and then the woman who betrayed her own kind to lie with you." Jed Stone stood beside Silas, his rifle held loosely, his face pale and slick with sweat. This was not what he had wanted. He had wanted to protect Abigail, to save the town from a threat he had imagined. But the reality was this: a terrified woman clutching a baby, a cornered man preparing to die, and a mob of his neighbors baying for blood. He saw the raw, murderous hatred in Silas's eyes and realized with sickening clarity that the monster was not the Apache in the shadows, but the man standing beside him. A shot rang out, fired by a nervous man in the back. The bullet ricocheted off the boulder near Abigail's head, sending stone chips flying. Kale returned fire instantly, a single, precise shot that extinguished a lantern on the far bank, plunging half the posse into darkness. The night erupted into chaos. Kyle fired again, not to kill, but to intimidate, to keep them at bay. But he was one man against a dozen. Silas raised his rifle, ignoring Kale completely. He took slow, deliberate aim at the sliver of Abigail's calico dress visible behind the rock. He would not give the warrior a clean death. He would make him watch as he destroyed the one thing he had left to live for. Jed saw it. He saw the cold, calculated aim. He saw the knuckle whiten on the trigger. Everything his father had taught him about decency, every memory of sharing a meal at Abigail's table with her husband, every last shred of his own humanity rose up in a single, desperate surge. "No!" he screamed, and lunged, shoving the barrel of Silas's rifle skyward just as it spat fire. The shot roared, harmlessly splitting the night air. Enraged at the betrayal, Silas spun, his face contorted, and brought the heavy stock of his rifle around in a vicious arc, striking Jed hard across the side of the head. Jed crumpled to the ground, his part in the drama finished. But his single act of defiance had bought them a crucial second. From the ridge above the creek, a new voice boomed, a voice that carried the undisputed weight of authority. "This is Marshal Elias Vance. Drop your weapons! You are all under arrest by authority of the United States government." Lanterns flared on the ridge, revealing the marshal and 2 deputies, their rifles leveled and steady. Behind them, illuminated like a vengeful angel, stood Martha Thorne, her face set like stone. The posse froze. The thrill of the hunt died, replaced by the cold, immediate fear of a federal noose. Men who had been monsters moments before were suddenly just farmers and storekeepers, their faces slack with shock as they began to drop their guns. But Silas Blackwood was beyond reason, beyond the law, beyond fear. He didn't even seem to hear the marshal. His entire world had narrowed to the woman and the child behind the rock. His grief, his rage, his loss, it all coalesced into a single, agonized point of focus. "Mary!" he shrieked, the name of his dead daughter, a raw, animal cry of pain that clawed its way out of his soul. His mind had finally, irrevocably shattered. He raised his rifle one last time, a wild, suicidal gesture aimed at the source of his torment. Before he could pull the trigger, the marshal's rifle cracked once, the sound sharp and final. Silas cried out, not in pain but in surprise, as he spun and collapsed, his rifle clattering onto the rocks. A crimson stain spread across his shoulder. The violence of his hatred finally turned back upon himself. A profound silence fell over the Devil's Creek, broken only by the rushing water, the whimpering of Jed, and the terrified, long-suppressed sobs of Samuel. The posse stood with their hands raised, their brief, bloody reign of terror over. Kyle slowly rose from behind the boulder, his rifle still ready, his body trembling with the last vestiges of adrenaline as he scanned the defeated faces of his enemies. Abigail clutched Samuel to her chest, whispering words of comfort to the child, her own tears finally falling, hot and cleansing, onto his soft hair. The war was over. Fan 6. The carved beam. Sevens. The chaos of the Devil's Creek subsided into the quiet, methodical work of justice. Marshal Vance, a man who had seen his share of frontier ugliness, directed his deputies with a grim efficiency, binding the hands of the posse members who now looked less like a lynch mob and more like shamefaced boys caught in a terrible crime. Silas Blackwood was hauled to his feet, a broken man, his eyes vacant, muttering his dead daughter's name as the marshal tended to the clean wound in his shoulder. He was a ghost now, no longer a threat, just a vessel of sorrow who would live out his days in a federal prison, haunted by a past he could never escape. Amid the official proceedings, Abigail saw Jed Stone sitting on a log, his head in his hands, a trickle of blood matting his hair. Cale stood guard over her and Samuel, his rifle held loosely but his eyes missing nothing, ensuring the threat was truly extinguished. Abigail tore a strip from her petticoat, soaked it in the cold creek water, and walked over to Jed. He looked up, his face a mess of bruises and profound shame. "Abigail, he stammered, unable to find the words. She said nothing, simply knelt and gently pressed the cool, wet cloth to the gash on his head. It was an act of grace he did not deserve, an absolution that felt heavier than any punishment. His apology was in the tears that welled in his eyes, and her forgiveness was in the quiet, steady pressure of her hand. Their shared past, tangled as it was, could finally begin to heal. The marshal approached them as the last of the posse was being led away. "You folks are free to go," he said, his gaze respectful. "What you did, taking in that child, it was a braver thing than facing any gun." He looked from Abigail's steadfast face to Cale's proud warrior bearing. "The world ain't always kind to folks who draw their own lines in the sand," he added, a hint of weariness in his voice. "But you go on and live your life. The law will handle this." The journey back to the cabin was a blur of exhaustion and relief. When they finally stepped across the threshold, the small, battered space felt like a palace. The broken shutter, the shattered window pane, the lingering scent of fear, none of it mattered. They were safe. They were home. They were together. That night, for the first time, there were no invisible lines, no unspoken fears. There was only the quiet comfort of three souls who had walked through fire and emerged, scarred but whole, on the other side. A year can be a lifetime in the West. As the green of a new spring washed over the Texas plains, the cabin on Lone Mesa was no longer a place of hiding, but a place of growth. A sturdy corral, built by Cale's skilled hands, now stood where Silas's men had once gathered. A vibrant garden, tended by Abigail, bloomed with the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, the seeds a gift from a small, peaceful band of Lipan Apache Cale had befriended. Their greatest change, however, stood where an old, dilapidated smokehouse had once been. Abigail, with help from a repentant Jed Stone, had transformed it into a one-room schoolhouse. The words of Isaiah were painted on a rough plank above the door. "And a little child shall lead them." Every morning, a half-dozen children would make their way to her door. Some were the sons and daughters of the very men who had ridden against her, their parents now sending them as a quiet act of atonement. Two were the children of the Lipan, shy and watchful, a bridge between two worlds. Abigail taught them letters and numbers, but more than that, she taught them kindness, showing by her own example that a person's worth was not in the color of their skin, but in the content of their character. Cale had found a new purpose as well. The hands that were once shaped for the bow and the knife now learned the plow and the hammer. He was a builder, a provider, a father. The haunted look in his eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady calm. His greatest joy was Samuel, now a sturdy toddler with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined spirit, who chased chickens in the yard and fell asleep to the sound of Apache lullabies. One warm evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, their new life found its ceremony. They stood beneath an arch of woven willow branches and wildflowers, facing a new, younger preacher from the town, a man who spoke of forgiveness. Their guests were few but meaningful. Martha Thorne stood as Abigail's witness, her face beaming with pride. And beside her stood Jed Stone, his head healed, his heart humbled, a quiet testament to the power of a second chance. There were no fancy vows. Cale, dressed in a clean buckskin shirt, took Abigail's hand. He slipped onto her finger a simple ring he had hammered from a silver dollar, its surface etched with a symbol that meant home. "My heart is your home," he said, the English words still new to him, but the meaning as old as the stars. Abigail, in her best calico dress, placed a newly made leather sheath, beautifully tooled with a hawk in flight, into his hands. "I will always honor the warrior who protects our home," she whispered. When the quiet ceremony was over and their friends had departed, Cale led Abigail inside the cabin. The fire was lit, casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls. He took out the carving knife he had used to make the small wooden horse a lifetime ago. He reached up to the great, rough-hewn beam that stretched across the hearth, the very heart of their house. With slow, deliberate strokes, he began to carve. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the room as the letters took shape, deep and permanent. First, his own name, Cale. Beside it, he carved hers, Abigail. And beneath them, connecting them both, the name that had started it all, Samuel. He stepped back, his arm around her waist, and they looked up at their story, etched forever into the wood. It was not just a record of names, but a testament to their journey, a declaration that family was not a thing of blood or of tribe, but a fortress built of courage, sealed with sacrifice, and warmed by a love that had refused to die. The fire crackled. Samuel slept peacefully in his sturdy new crib, and under the endless Texas sky, their life had truly begun. And so, the story of Abigail, Cale, and Samuel comes to a close, not with the roar of a rifle, but with the quiet, steady rhythm of a family's heart. Theirs is a journey that began in the deepest wells of grief and desperation, sparked by a single, courageous act of compassion that defied a world drowning in fear and prejudice. It is a powerful reminder that the most formidable frontiers are not the vast, empty plains or the rugged mountains, but the divides we build between each other. This tale teaches us that family is not forged in blood alone, but is carved into the very beams of our lives through sacrifice, understanding, and the unwavering choice to answer hatred with love. It shows that true strength is not in the fist we clench, but in the hand we extend to another, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply to open their door. In a world that often feels divided, the spirit of this story, the courage to nurture, the strength to forgive, and the wisdom to build a home where there was none, is more vital than ever. If this story of a love that bridged two worlds and a family born from courage resonated with you, please help us share it. Like this video to show your support, share it with someone who believes in the power of hope, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales that explore the untamed landscapes of both the frontier and the human heart. What does the word family mean to you? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for riding with us.